This is Polyamory Weekly, tales from the front of responsible non-monogamy from a pansexual, kink-friendly point of view. A warning for our under 18 listeners. This is an adult-oriented podcast about really lascivious things, like communication and honesty in relationships. If you're under 18 and looking for upfront advice and answers to questions about sex, please visit scarletteen.com.
This is Polyamory Weekly, episode 566 for December 15th, 2018. Coming up on today's show, toxic masculinity. That's coming up on today's show. Hello, everyone. I am your host, Minx, and I am going to just skip the host chat this week and skip Polly in the news, and we are going to get straight down to this amazing discussion that I had with Kevin Patterson, Chris Smith, and Lusty Guy, talking about what toxic masculinity means to them and how they react to it and how, frankly, men should be reacting to it. Let's jump straight in. Hello, everyone. I am super excited to have quite the panel of experts talking about toxic masculinity today. So I am going to start with asking Kevin Patterson, our friend, to introduce himself.
Hey, I'm Kevin Patterson. I run the blog Poly Role Models. I wrote a book, Love's Not Colorblind, Race and Representation, and something. And also, I wrote the recent fiction book For Hire Operator with Alana Phelan.
And we're also welcoming back to the podcast Chris Smith. Welcome. You want to share with our new listeners who you are and what you do?
So hi, my name is Christopher Smith. I am a doctoral student at Howard University. I am a researcher of relationship structures. I'm the author of Open to Love, Polyamory in the Black American. And I'm actually about to start a new research project that looks into why people of color aren't represented heavily in polyamorous spaces, including in social media.
And bringing up the rear, as is his favorite position, Lusty Guy.
Wow, it's like she's met me or something. Hey, everybody, it's Lusty Guy, co-host and co-producer of Polyweekly, and, basically an annoying presence that shows up semi-regularly.
And if you're thinking, wow, that is an awful lot of Y chromosomes on the panel today, well, there's a reason for that. It's because our topic today is toxic masculinity. And who better to talk about that than toxic men? I mean, really smart men whom we really, really love. So let's start out with talking about what is your best definition of toxic masculinity? What is it? What do we really need to know about it?
I know I always go with the idea that toxic masculinity is sort of a stereotype of masculinity that leads into negative behaviors, domination, pain, a lack of showing emotions, or passing on of pain, like hurting people, dominating people, bullying, not showing emotion, the things that are typically attributed to men, if we're speaking in a very binary sort of sense, and not giving men sort of room to breathe in terms of vulnerability and emotion.
Yeah, I basically think of it as the expectations of masculine behavior that are wrapped up in our culture's expectations on gender that in turn generally produce negative effects in men and women and everybody in between.
When I look at toxic masculinity, I look at toxicity itself as a separate definition from masculinity, because masculinity, or the idea of being masculine, does not have to be toxic. But what makes it toxic is when we try to set absolutes on how the masculine is supposed to be presented, and it forces people to try to fit into a certain conditioning that is often not only super aggressive, but uncaring, unaware, and uninhibited.
I saw this commercial once. It was a pair of, like, I think it was mechanics, and there was some slip and fall, maybe like some motor oil was involved, and they ended up, and like these two mechanics fell over and ended up kissing. And so then one of them looks at the other one and says, I mean,
Nice.
no, because like the reaction was really strong. The reaction was like, oh no,
Yeah.
we've got to do something manly to sort of save face because of their tender moment. So next thing you know, they're pulling each other's like chest hair out and beating each other up because otherwise they might catch the gay or something like that. Like whenever I hear toxic masculinity, that's the first thing that pops up into my head. That commercial.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that you hit it on the head earlier when you said that it doesn't have to be inherently toxic. It's just that there's a certain point when that behavior is taken to enough of an extreme that it becomes so. There's a certain time and place where we do all just have to keep a stiff upper lip and, not show how we're really feeling and do the right thing at that moment. But when that's the only tool
Right.
that you have in the toolbox as a man, now you have a problem. And when in fact, when it's considered less than masculine to bring any other tool to that situation, now you have a problem, right? It's almost the Shakespearean tragedy. A little bit of it, or just the right amount of that quality, is useful. But when you get too much of it, that's when you get into the area of toxicity.
Exactly. Like toxicity is just a sense of overabundance. I believe toxicity can exist in any form, whether it's masculine, feminine, non-binary, whatever label you want to put. Anything can be toxic according to how it is advocated for and how it is lived. I've found that we often look at the idea of masculine as toxic because we have lived in a very patriarchal, heteronormative, mononormative society that has put issues or literally persecuted or discriminated against people who did not fit into that thing. However, as was being stated priorly, the idea of being masculine, whatever that means for this society, can actually be of a benefit. Like I'm a military person. The idea of running around, and also a sports person. I love rugby, I love football, I love contact sports, I love mixed martial arts, and all those are seen are very masculine, but they're not toxic. Some of the greatest things I've had, now they may be dangerous, I'm not going to lie. Football and all its classism and racism is horrible. But the game itself and the game of rugby and the sport of martial arts has brought me closer to people that happen to share the same sex as I, or even the opposite sex, has it more than anything else, because you're in a place of not only like proximity, but you're going through struggles together.
Thanks, Chris. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that I think toxic masculinity isn't just toxic to the people who aren't men, but it's also rather toxic to the men themselves. It's really, really limiting. My God, I was just listening to a Radio Lab about the flux you can get in if a man dares wear pink, especially in the US. Now, thankfully, in Europe, a little more permissible. But, there are a lot of things that men just aren't supposed to be able to do without raising an eyebrow, including things like showing emotions, wearing colors, caring about clothes, coiffing their hair. I mean, it's really, really limiting. And it really doesn't, not only is it detrimental to everybody in society who isn't identified as a male, but it's detrimental to the men themselves too, right?
I mean, something that's really interesting about that is that we're, as men, part of that expectation is that we're not supposed to be sensitive, but those are the kinds of things we're sensitive to, which is really ridiculous if you think about it. Where if, you're not supposed to care about clothes, but you care about the guy who cares about clothes. You care enough to deride this person, to talk trash about this person. Like, I remember there was a lot of talk about metrosexuality, like a decade or so ago, when really that was just like men who dressed well, men who took care of themselves. Like, it was such a foreign concept in our patriarchal society that we had to adopt a new name for it. And then there had to be people who were so above that they decided to spend a lot of time talking trash about those people. It's like when you got the family with the stick figure, you got the stick figure family on the back of the windshield, and then you got the one guy that has the sticker that says, "I don't care about your your stick figure family? It's like, well, you cared enough to spend money buying a sticker that said you didn't care. So you kind of care. You kind of care a lot. And that's sort of a thing that we do with toxic masculinity, where we spend a bunch of time not talking about clothes. We talk about the people who talk about the clothes. So really, what are we doing here? Is this what are we wasting our energy on? Who does this serve? Who does this help?
Well, I think that, Chris pointed out correctly earlier, too, when he said that this was part and parcel of the larger patriarchy that is in culture. And it's serving this social organization that we've used as a part of Western culture for a long time that, for a lot of reasons now, we're finding in no longer works, and for good reason. But one thing I specifically want to circle back to and talk about in terms of sports really illustrates how this vision of masculinity simply doesn't work. One of the things that we talk about all the time in team sports is the fragility of the team culture, of the team chemistry, how important it is that everybody get along, how important it is that they clear the air and teams get together and have frank conversations. Well, look, all that is doing is acknowledging the emotional reality of the men involved in those teams. And it's saying that emotional reality is so important that it affects the outcome on the field. Well, you can't simultaneously be stoic and unemotional and so emotional that you all got to have the right team chemistry to go out and play the game. Having said that, though, I think we also do need to acknowledge, Chris is exactly right in terms of the positive things that can come from sports. I think we also do have to acknowledge that in American culture, organized men-only sports, the jocularity has been a strongly negative influence as well. It's powerful both ways, right?
To piggyback off of that, Lusty Guy, and also what Chris said, something else that's interesting about the toxic masculinity, about how it's not inherently toxic, is that it's not inherently masculine. A lot of the things that we attribute to masculinity, like strength or confidence or bravery, personal responsibility, these things that we call masculine, can inhabit everybody, So I think it's telling that even in society we attribute this to men as if it's some foreign concept to women or non-binary folks or whoever else, It's kind of silly how we're limiting this, and then how we're twisting it into something that doesn't really serve anybody, something that harms both the people who perpetuate it and the people they're perpetuating it on.
I was going to say real quick, just to piggyback off Kevin, I think that's the real thing to focus on. It's the fact that we, even in a lot of our freedom, we still limit ourselves to assigning or even thinking about assigning certain characteristics to certain sexes or to certain ideas of being. And I think that's problematic all around. And I don't think just masculine folk do that. I think feminine individuals do that. I think it's a cultural conditioning that we all have to sit down, reevaluate, and understand that characteristics aren't inherently built into one sex or the other, is that we've conditioned it into one sex or the other. Some of the most inspiring people I've ever met have been individuals who, quote unquote, are feminine, because they live very loudly, they live very proudly, and they live very smart. And they have shown that they can thrive and exist even in circumstances that were conditioned against them.
Chris is exactly right. And it brings up a really fun story of mine from business school. There's a classic story, and believe it or not, this applies, when you're learning about accounting versus finance. And the finance professor gets up and says, if you ask an accounting guy what 2 + 2 is, they'll say it's 4. If you ask a finance guy what 2 + 2 is, they'll say, what do you want it to be? Mm-hmm. The meaning that we ascribe to these gender differences is in that what do we want it to be area. And as a culture, what we've wanted it to be for a long time is masculine is powerful. Masculine is strong. Masculine is the provider. But that's not because 2 + 2 is 4. That's because that's what we've wanted, in quotes, right? That's what we've made that meaning to be. And we are now in a process at a time when we're making that meaning into something else. And that means it's a little rough and bumpy, and there's lots of argumentation going on. And I think that gets into one of the topics that I wanted to talk about and get you guys' reactions about, which is this negative reaction to the term toxic masculinity. If we're talking about something which, when you have it in the right amount, is good, and when you have it in too much makes negative things, toxic poison, that's pretty close. That kind of hits it to me. And if we're then talking about things that, as a culture, we generally associate with masculinity, so toxic masculinity, I get it. It works for me. I don't have a negative reaction. Can you guys talk about the general negative reaction to the term and how you parse it?
I look at masculinity, and I've been asked like some version of this question before. I look at masculinity as Captain America. Captain America is sort of my gauge in terms of like Captain America has strength, he has confidence, but like he uses that to protect, to defend, and as long as I'm trying to move in that direction, I'm okay. So when someone uses the term toxic masculinity, I try to gauge what they're talking about as, on a scale of Captain America to toxic masculinity, where am I? And that's where I'm, or like, where am I, or where is that this action that I've taken, and how can I don't know, like how can I get better? What kind of work can I do to stay away from that? So like I don't worry about the term toxic masculinity, because I know that either A, it's not applying to me, or B, it's applying to me in a way that I need to view it as something I can do better, something I can work harder at, something I can fix and make amends with anyone who I've harmed,
What about you, Chris?
Lusty Guy, that's a great question. Similar to what Kevin just said, anytime somebody says toxic masculinity around me, the first thing I do is do like a self-check, a self-assessment to really see where my motives, my mindsets, and my foundations are, so that I can really speak from an authentic and transparent place of non-toxicity. And if I do find something that may be toxic within myself, because we all find things that are toxic within ourselves, it's a growing process. I approach it. But also when I hear it, it kind of burdens. Oh, I don't know if burdens is the right word, but it kind of like raises an alarm for me, because I hear it said so much, but I also hear it said, I would dare say, out of context or out of understanding, just as a general label for something that is quote unquote seen as masculine. So it also raises an alarm for me if these individuals are understanding, one, that masculinity is a construct, and that two, toxicity is a choice and an action. And I find that a lot of people struggle to separate the two. It's like toxic masculinity has become one normalized phrase when they're two different words that have two different meanings and don't necessarily have to be associated with each other. I've been around a mass of people that will claim toxic masculinity over some of the most non-toxic things, simply because they're up in arms about how they feel about something, or about how they've been hurt and traumatized, which is very valid. But even in the validity of our trauma, we have to understand that our trauma is our trauma. And that doesn't mean that everybody is, one, that traumatic factor or that enemy.
No, I think you're right. And oftentimes, Chris, the last tool that we put in the box is the one that we apply, whether or not it exactly fits.
What do we need to know about this idea of toxic masculinity with respect to polyamory?
I think what we get a lot of in terms of our representation is this idea of like this stereotypical masculine fantasy, this male fantasy of harems. When people look at our polyamory, and it doesn't get helped at all by like some of the TV shows that have had non-monogamy in them. But like we get these stock footage of one guy and multiple women or things like that, and we have to make sure that that's not a thing that we internalize. And like, even in terms of the books, and like, I know I spoke about this on this podcast before when I was doing research for the book For Hire. We saw that so many of the books that called themselves polyamorous were harem fantasies. And on the covers, it was like, a big, beefy, burly, cut dude surrounded by women in bikinis and things like that. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah. And we get so much of that. So it's something that you have to work hard to like not internalize. You have to make sure that you're not placing ownership over your partners. You have to make sure that you're not putting yourself or seeing yourself as in competition. It's a Sunday here, and I just finished watching the New York Giants game with my metamor. And as a male metamor, as someone who is also together with my wife, a partner that we share, this guy's supposed to be a rival. This guy's supposed to be an enemy. That's what society tells me, that I shouldn't be watching the game with this guy. I should be trying to kill this guy, And instead, we're hanging out, watching the game, and every once in a while, we have relevant conversation about our shared partner, Hey, general stuff like, is she on her way home? What's she up to? What's she doing? Do I need to take care of her? Do you need to take care of her? Things like that. We're a team, but society says that we're supposed to be enemies. And that's something that you always have to be really mindful of. Like, these are the messages that we get as male-bodied humans.
I think there are two things, to build on Kevin's point, that in the poly community we really have to address in terms of toxic masculinity. And the first, of course, is to steal from Avenue Q, everybody's a little bit toxic. One of the notions that's come up with both.
Nice.
I thought you'd like that.
Musical theater reference? Yes, of course I like it.
Indeed. Both Kevin and Chris have talked about there are times when there are behavior that we will display that we're going to look at and say, hey, you know what? I need to learn from this and see what's going on. Somebody's pointed out to me that this is an expression of toxic masculinity myself. And so that's one of the things in the polyamorous scene that we all have to be really aware of, is that we're all going to screw up sometimes. Two, the dreaded one penis policy, right? That is a core expression of the exact kind of competition and fear that Kevin was just talking about, that is wrapped up in having too much feeling like you are the leader of the relationship. You're not. I don't care if you're a self-identified man. I don't care what genitalia you have. The leader of the relationship is equal to the number of people in it. And when you can release yourself of that burden, you'll understand what a negative effect this thing that we're calling toxic masculinity has had on you and everybody around you.
Lusty Guy, like, to piggyback off of that, like, you got to do some real serious mental gymnastics to make the one penis policy seem rational. I mean, I've talked to guys, I in my capacity as the curator of poly role models, I've had to have a lot of conversations with people about their identities and how it impacts their polyamory. And what I get from a lot of guys are these really outrageous sort of explanations for why they enforce these one penis policies. And
oh my God, you want to hear what mine was? When you get a chance, I'll tell you what mine was years ago.
Oh no, I want to hear it. And like, what I've heard was, I've heard a guy tell me that, like, having other men around his female partner would change her aura.
Wait,
and
what?
That would impact their relationship. Yeah, her aura. I remember hearing a guy tell me that, like, having other penises around his partner would change her DNA, which would then impact any future children they might have.
Wow.
Wow.
Oh my God,
Oh my God, people believe that?
Yeah, and my wife jumped me into a conversation with a guy where he wasn't hearing anything that she was trying to say as far as the one penis policy. And yeah. And so all of a sudden I get a group message that says, here's my husband. He'll explain it to you. Just jumped right into the conversation. I jump in and I explain to the guy, like, look, your problem isn't aura. Your problem isn't DNA or whatever random excuse he had. Your problem is that you're worried that some guy's going to show up with a bigger dick, is going to dick down your woman and run away with her forever. Your problem is insecurity. Your problem is homophobia. Your problem is misogyny. And the guy had to cop to it. Like, he tried to cop to it softly, like, oh, well, I'm sure that's kind of a factor, I guess. I'm like, no, dude, that's the whole thing. Because everything else you're saying is nonsense. And eventually he had to back down off of it, and then he had to either own his shit and do some work or lose his partner, one or the other.
Damn, you got to give him credit for copping to it that quick. So years ago, and by years ago, I mean like 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, Elle and I had a de facto one penis policy. Now, it's not completely accurately described that way because it wasn't something that I imposed. It was something we both agreed and wanted to do. But it still nevertheless worked out to be that I was the only dick involved. And the rationale on my side, as twisted and convoluted as it was as follows. Makeup sex is a vital part of keeping relationships together, I said. If you don't have access to makeup sex, then you're not going to be as likely to stay together, I said. And so, since I'm not bi, any other dick that comes around, we're not going to have access to makeup sex. It's inherently unstable, I said.
I can't even believe that.
Wow. Man.
That was a whole production.
Oh my God. All because, like 25 years ago, this little kid from small town, bumfuck wherever, for as advanced as I thought I was still scared of, other dick being around at heart, of course. Now, over time, we ended up going to swinger events and there was plenty of dick involved and more than one at the same time. And it was all good and didn't care. But yeah, there was a time when we had a de facto, Elle and I had a de facto one penis policy. Again, it wasn't something I was imposed, but we both agreed on. And that was my rationale. We needed to have equal access to makeup sex.
Well, I thank you for sharing that. News to me after we've been together how long? 7 years. So, wow. And I'm afraid our time is almost up. So I wanted to check with each of you and let me know if there are any final parting thoughts on that you'd like people to think about in terms of toxic masculinity. I'll start with Chris, and then we'll move on to Kevin and Lusty Guy.
When it comes to toxicity in any construct as a whole, we have to look at how we operate. We have to look at how we form thoughts, and we just have to look at how we operate and how we form our mindsets and thoughts impacts the people around us. I think that anything toxic, particularly masculinity, we have to consider impact. And a lot of individuals who identify as masculine do not consider the impact of what they do to the people around them, to the culture around them, to the environment around them. So it starts with taking a step back and realizing how you are impacting the people around you.
All right. Sorry, I'm going to tangent because that's what I do. I'm a storyteller. When my wife and I entered non-monogamy together 16 years ago, the first time that she went out with and hooked up with another dude, I told myself, I don't know how I'm going to react to this. So I'm going to ask her for all of the details, every single one of the details. Tell me about the guy. Tell me about the date. Tell me about the sex. Tell me every single thing. And what I expected was to lose my mind. I expected to get really upset. I expected to flip tables because this was new territory for me, and everything I've been fed through media and pop culture tells me I'm supposed to be very upset here. And by the end of her telling me everything that happened, the only thing I cared about was that she had a good time and that she was home. That was it. That was my genuine feeling was just, I'm glad she's home. I'm glad she had a good time. A lot of what we do in terms of toxic masculinity is performative. Is performative not just for others, but also for ourselves. I could have acted angry. I could have flipped out. I could have done, but instead, I went with what my gut told me, and my gut was fine. A lot of us don't do that, and a lot of us need to do that. A lot of us need to spend time examining our feelings, not just the behaviors involved, but where they're coming from. Is this genuinely how I feel about a thing? Or is this how I'm supposed to feel about a thing? Is this how I'm expected to feel about a thing? And then working from that point forward, It's all part of the owning your shit process, really.
Lusty Guy?
Well, I want to thank both Kevin and Chris for coming on, guys, and having this, what I think is an important topic. And the reason why I think it's an important topic is because when women enter into relationships with men, they are risking their lives. And men die younger in our culture. And they do so, to tell a little story, in part because, as a doctor friend of mine said, when you go into the emergency room, there'll be a Latin grandmother who is surrounded by 12 people, all of her family taking care of her. And then in the back, there'll be some middle-aged white guy all by himself puking his guts out. The downside of toxic masculinity is real, and it makes people die. So if you're aware of that, and I think a lot of people who listen to this show are, and then find yourself arguing against the term, you're really not putting your argumentation in a good place. Those of us who know that our gender differences create behaviors that results in death need to get over any negative feelings we might have and wordsmithing we might have and want to say, oh, I don't like that term. Just accept it and move on, and let's start dealing with the behaviors that term encompasses. Because when we do, it's going to be a gift to all of us. Men are going to live longer and freer as well. It's not just about some theoretical zero-sum power game. It's about making things better for everybody.
Thanks, Lusty Guy. Insightful as always. And let's go back through. We'll go backwards this time and tell everyone where they can find you online, starting with you, Lusty Guy.
Well, I can be found right here blowing hot air all the time, and happy to be riding the coattails of Minx. Thank you all, and I'm going away now.
And Kevin?
You can find me. I'm Poly Role Models at everywhere. I'm Poly Role Models on Patreon, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Tumblr. That might change soon since Tumblr's being a little suspect right now. You can find my books. My books are available on Amazon, and that's Love's Not Colorblind, Race and Representation in Polyamorous and Other Alternative Communities, and the Superhero Fiction for Hire Operator, which I'm really excited at. I'm really excited to put out some inclusive fiction. If you jump back to Polyweekly episode 563, it's me and my co-writer, Alana Phelan, talking all about it. So you can find us there. Books are available, and yeah, that's me.
We'll put a link to all of those in the show notes. And Chris?
You can find me on Instagram at Christopher or Smith Christopher N, or just hit me on email on tenabilitymovement@gmail.com.
We'll put that in the show notes as well. Thanks to all of our panel for sharing some thoughts on toxic masculinity that, kind of got me thinking too. So thanks, folks. I really appreciate it.
Problem.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you, guys. That was great. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Kevin and Chris and Lusty Guy for facilitating that conversation. I don't know about you, but that's something I really needed to hear, and something that I really wanted to just sit back and listen to and sit with. I hope that was helpful to you as well. If it wasn't, or if it was, or if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can email polyweekly@gmail.com. You can always attach an audio comment if you like, or you can call our listener comment line at 802-505-POLY. If you want Lusty Guy or me to teach at your next class or event, or you're interested in some coaching, or you think you know of a good podcast guest, including you, email lustyguy@polyweekly.com. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook as Polyweekly. All of our show notes and searchable archives are at polyweekly.com, along with an online course and all the slide decks for every class we've ever taught, along with a great blog post about how to write your own user manual, which is one of the most frequently asked questions that we get. Oh yes, and on the website, there's also a frequently asked questions section. And I think that about wraps it up for today's show, so I will bid you good night and say thanks for listening. And remember, it's not all about the sex.